Hello, my Old Testament students. This is going to be a short video where I kind of quickly walk you through Leviticus, Numbers, and I might just try to get Deuteronomy all in one because it's all Exodus-y stuff. My last video, I walked you through the main contents of the Exodus, as well as how Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, fit together as a whole. That's really important to know if you want to understand the Exodus accounts. But right now we're going to start off with kind of walking you through the file, the PDF, not the PDF, but the download file that you can access in the modules. We're going to quickly go through the big things of Leviticus. Obviously, it's not the most page-turner of an Old Testament book. Nobody really says, hey, I'm going to read Leviticus for fun, because it's obviously all very technical, sacrificial-related directions. It's not fun to read necessarily, unless you understand kind of what it's getting at, and that's the bigger picture, is what I'm going to try to get for you in this video. Now, obviously, what I prepared for you is kind of a basic outline of Leviticus on that first page, where you can kind of see. The first 7 chapters is just instructions on how to do the various prescribed offerings in the tabernacle sacrificial system that is laid out at Mount Sinai, basically. And now, if you look at the second page, I've kind of written this out, but here's the big thing to realize about the sacrificial system. On the surface, it looks very much like any other ancient Near Eastern sacrificial system. The pagans did sacrifices as well. And so when it gets right down to it, a lot of the directions are the same thing. The thing you have to make sure you have to really understand about what makes the Israelite sacrificial system different is the motivation for why they're doing it. Now, in the ancient Near East, people, pagans, they sacrificed to their gods to try to curry favor with the gods, to appease them, to make sure they don't strike them down, because the gods, as you know, were considered to be a little nutty. So that's why they were doing it. The ancient Near Eastern pagans would sacrifice to their gods, not because they loved them, but because they were afraid of them and they wanted to kind of buy them off and curry their favor. All right. In addition to that, if you went to a pagan temple, the priests would often engage in clairvoyance to kind of tell the future. They would take a goat, slaughter him, take out his entrails, put them on a table, and read the entrails to try to figure out what your fortune was. So it's that kind of fortune-telling nuttiness that you still see today on various, what are the Miss Chloe's fortune-telling billboard you can see occasionally around here. None of that was in the Israelite sacrificial system. They didn't do the sacrifices because they were afraid of the God of Israel, Yahweh. They were doing it for a different purpose. And that's point number 2 on page number 2. The Israelite sacrificial system was different. What they were doing the sacrifices for was in the context of that Mosaic covenant that they, as God's people, unique God's people, did. Okay, and so basically, what they would do is, let's say, a man and his family go to the tabernacle to do any one of those sacrifices. Basically, what would happen is they would give the goat or the lamb or whatever to the priest. The priest would sacrifice it on the altar, kind of cook it. Then the priest, acting on behalf of God, would eat a portion of that, because that's what you're offering to God. You're offering him a free meal, basically. But then what they would do is, once they would take their portion and eat it on behalf of God, they would give you back the cooked meat, and then you and your family would eat that meal at God's house, at the tabernacle, and later the temple. And basically what you were doing is that meal was seen as a celebration of reconciliation with God. because it was understood, as you see throughout the Mosaic Law, there would be certain things you would do that you would sin. You would inevitably break God's law because you're a human being and you're sinful. That was a given. Okay? But because he wants to enter into relationship with his people, he used the sacrificial system, the ancient Near Eastern sacrificial system, as a way of reconciliation in a loving covenant, hesed relationship with God. As opposed to the ancient Near Eastern people, the pagans, they would do it as to buy off, appease angry gods. That is a really key difference. So if you ever do read through Leviticus and you read through all the details of what they were supposed to do, that on the surface looks a lot like ancient pagan sacrificial stuff, but you have to understand all that stuff in the context of this covenant. It takes on a whole different meaning. And so that is one of the key things to understand, particularly with those first 7 chapters where they're just going through all the sacrifices. Chapters 8 through 10 is a kind of an odd little narrative story about how to consecrate the priests at the tabernacle. And you have this one story of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu. They bring unauthorized fire to the temple, the tabernacle sacrifices, and the fire comes out and consumes them and they die. Right after that, there's some talk and extra rules about how not against drunkenness. So it's believed that Nadab and Abihu somehow was basically doing the priestly rituals drunk, and they kind of screwed up. And the point is, God's point is, if you're going to do the temple, the tabernacle, sacrificial stuff, the priests shouldn't be drunk and do things against how I prescribed it. Because I'm a holy God, I want you to do it in a certain way. You're a holy people. The way you do the sacrificial system is supposed to be different than your pagan neighbors, and so therefore we can't have priests who represent me stumbling around drunk. And so that's kind of what you see there. Chapters 11 through 15, there are quite a few laws concerning what is clean and unclean, and there's a lot of allusions to Genesis, and I've kind of given you some examples of all the purification rituals in Leviticus, how it actually kind of mirrors the flood story in a lot of ways. Literally, it's kind of interesting. So the point is, the priests are supposed to go around cleansing things ritually, and often there's some specific, disease how they do that. But the way they bring about cleansing echoes the flood story, the way God cleansed the world of ancient corruption and sin. So that's kind of an interesting thing to realize. So again, when you're reading all that technical stuff of how they get rid of things in a house, the background is God is cleansing things just like the flood story. It's kind of an interesting thing. Chapter 16 is very important. He mentions the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. This is the one day a year that the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies and make a sacrifice on behalf of all the people for all the sins that they didn't cover, basically. The daily sacrifices dealt with their daily sin, but the Day of Atonement was unique for atoning for Israel's sin as a nation. It involves 2 goats. It's kind of a symbolic thing. The first goat belonged to the Lord, and it was offered as a sin offering on behalf of the people. They would take the blood, they would sprinkle it on the atonement cover of the Ark of the Covenant, symbolically saying it's the blood of the covenant, brings about salvation for his people. And obviously, if you look at it from a New Testament perspective, there's a lot of foreshadowing of Jesus' death. Actually, the better way to say it is in the New Testament, when Jesus gets crucified, Paul and the New Testament writers, to explain the significance of that, they look back at the sacrificial language here, and they basically say what Jesus is doing is like this. Okay, so you kind of see the intertestamental connection as well. But in any case, the first goat would be sacrificed for the atonement of the people. The second goat is called the scapegoat. That's where we get the term from, is the priest would then lay their hands on the second goat and release the goat into the desert to Azazel, like the goat demon, Satan, basically, to bear the sins of the nation. So they sacrifice the first goat to get atonement, and then they lay all their sins on the second goat, and the second goat goes off to the evil one, basically. But the Day of Atonement is a very important thing to realize. It's central to Israel's identity. Chapter 17 is that weird story about the goat demons. Like I mentioned in the last video, apparently the priests themselves don't quite get what is proper and not proper in God's sacrificial system. And so after that, the rest of Leviticus is the holiness code, where God is teaching, or God through Moses, is teaching the priests exactly what the difference is between clean and unclean, holy and unholy, ritually speaking. Okay, and so we have some stuff there. In chapter 25, there is a sabbatical year, where the idea is every 50th year every 7th year. Let's put it this way: if you were a poor farmer and you had to go into debt, every 7th year you were released from your debt. It was kind of a Sabbath year, where just like God rested on the 7th day, you are given a break in the 7th year, and your debts are cleared, and you get to start afresh. So you and your family are not in perpetual debt for generations. That was the Sabbath year. And then a year of Jubilee was every 7th Sabbath year. So in year 50, it was considered the entire year was holy, where there was a complete restoration of land, property, and debt. All that was wiped clean across the board as a nation. And so that was kind of their way of making sure things stayed just. Now, obviously, that's the ideal. Throughout the Israel's history, they didn't really do that much. They were corrupt, which is why they get kicked out of the land later on. But that's the idea set out in Leviticus. Okay, and then finally in Leviticus, there's kind of a reaffirmation of the covenant. There you go. I also give you a chart, if you're a visual person like I am, a chart of how Leviticus is kind of laid out. I think that's helpful as well. Okay, so that's Leviticus. Now we're going to go through Numbers. Numbers, unfortunate name Numbers, because Numbers is actually a really interesting book, because it's all about the wilderness wanderings. It's a lot of narrative. Now, that being said, the first 10 chapters, if you look on the download for the number stuff, as I show you the outline, the first 10 chapters is just a lot of preparations for them leaving Sinai. So obviously they get to Sinai in Exodus 19. They have the covenant laid out, the golden calf they sinned, the covenant is renewed, the priestly code is laid out, but then the priests screw up, and so they have the holiness code. All that's going on while they're at Sinai. But then when you get to Numbers, the first 10 chapters, we find out that they're about to leave Sinai. And chapters 1 through 10 is just a whole bunch of kind of boring chapters about all their preparations for leaving Sinai. From there, from chapter 10, pretty much all through to the end of Numbers, it's the account of their wilderness wanderings. It starts with the tribes marching from Sinai to Kadesh. You have various stories, and one of the main themes that you see in Numbers is rebellion. The people are always rebelling. Even Miriam and Aaron kind of challenge Moses' authority at one point. In any case, they make their way to Canaan. In chapters 13 and 14 is the story of Joshua and Caleb and the 12 spies, where they go into Canaan to check it out. They come back and they say, it's a wonderful land, but there are giants in the land. There's the descendants of the Nephilim from chapter 6 in Genesis. They call the Anakim are there. Think of Goliath figures. They're just too powerful for us. We can't take it. Joshua and Caleb say, no, with God's help, we can. But the people say, screw that. We're not going in. And because they don't put their faith in God and in Moses, God basically says, all right, this generation, you're not getting in. Going back to the wilderness for a generation until you all die out, and then your kids will take the land. And at that point, the people say, ooh, we don't want to live in the desert. We'll take the land. And Moses says, God's not with you. And they say, forget that, we're taking the land. And they go in and they get their butts kicked and they learn their lesson and they're off to the wilderness. And you have all the stories throughout the rest of Numbers of their time in the wilderness. We're not going to go through them all. There's a rebellion of Korah. It was a Levite who thought he and his fellow Levites should have more power. The rest of it is basically kind of narrative of their wilderness wanderings. Eventually, by the end in chapter 20, Miriam dies and then Aaron dies. But then in chapter 21 to 26, it's like the new generation. After 40 years have passed, 21 through 26 is the account of them making their way back to Canaan. And every time they defeat a king, and again, there's a lot more to go into, news precedes them as they make their way to Canaan, and various kings fall. Some kings who try to stop them get destroyed. Chapter 22 to 24 is the very interesting story of Balaam and his donkey. What that is about is Balak of the Moabites sees Israel coming, and he knows he can't stop them, so he hires Balaam, who is considered a seer or some kind of prophetic figure, to come and curse the Israelites. And this is the story where Balaam eventually goes for a price, and this is the story where Balaam's donkey keeps going off the road because he sees an angel there, and Balaam doesn't see the angel, and eventually the donkey talks to Balaam, and Balaam's eyes are open, and he realizes that God does not want him to go and curse Israel, and instead, when he gets to Balak, Balaam goes up a mountain, and he proceeds 3 different times to bless Israel. And each time, Balak, the king of Moab, is saying, what are you doing? You're supposed to curse them. But eventually, the point is, Israel was blessed. They're taking the land. But then, because Balak knows that he can't stop them, in chapter 25, what he does, at Balaam's suggestion, is he sends his women, Moabite women, into the camp of the Israelites. And the Israelite men really like the Moabite women. And basically, they engage in orgies with the Moabite women in kind of a pagan worshiping of their gods. They commit idolatry and do bad idolatry stuff. And at that point, Moses punishes them, and there's death, etc., etc. Eventually, the rest of Numbers is various accounts of them making their way to Canaan, dealing with different pagan kings. But there is one thing I do want to mention. They do mention, I think it is mentioned in Leviticus too, I forgot that. Plans are made for when they do get into Canaan of various things. In chapter 35, it mentions the Levitical cities. They're going to break up the land among the 12 tribes. Well, it's not totally the 12 tribes because the Levites don't get their own land. The Levites act as the priests for the rest of the tribes. And so what happens is the other tribes get the land, their allotments of land. The Levites get cities throughout all the other tribes. And so in chapter 35, we're told about the Levitical cities. So the Levites had their own cities in each of the tribal territories to live so they could be the priests for the other tribes. Also in chapter 35 is the cities of refuge. And this is important because it's how to deal with cases of manslaughter and stuff. Let's say Bob here gets into a fight with Dave and he accidentally kills Dave. He didn't murder Dave, it was manslaughter. Dave's family might not care and might want to kill Bob. So what was laid out is there would be various cities of refuge throughout the territories where Bob could flee to and have sanctuary and safety in a city of refuge until his court case came and it was adjudicated. So that was the idea of a city of refuge. So vigilante vengeance couldn't be taken. That's the idea. All right. Also in Numbers, I give you another kind of story chart so you can kind of see how the whole thing is laid out. But those are the big picture things for the book of Numbers. There's other things, but you want to you want to know basically that stuff. Finally, the book of Deuteronomy is concerned. I'm going to hold off on Deuteronomy because I don't have my notes in front of me. Let me see here. Oh, here they are. Okay, Deuteronomy it's kind of a different book. It's Deuteronomy. Deutero means second. Nomos means law. It's kind of like the second giving of the law. The book of Deuteronomy is presented, if you read it, as Moses' farewell speeches before he dies. Okay? Hence the second giving of the law. He reiterates everything that has gone on in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Okay? They're on the edge of Canaan, about to go into Canaan, and Moses knows he's not going to be allowed to go into Canaan. He's going to die. So Deuteronomy is presented as his final few speeches before he goes. Now, historically speaking, and we haven't gotten to this yet, in the history of Israel, it's believed that King Josiah in roughly 620-ish BC, now again, we will have to go through the timeline as we go through it, King Josiah was famous for doing some major reformations in Israel, and it's believed that one of the things he did in roughly 627-ish, 620-ish, something around there, he renovated the temple. And it was during that time when he had the priests renovate and fix up the temple that the priests found the book of the law that apparently had been missing for hundreds of years. The Torah, basically. And so when Josiah reads it, and he reads in the Torah the blessings and the curses, what you get if you obey the Torah and what will happen if you disobey the Torah, and he reads that and he goes, oh my gosh, we're in trouble. So he really launches a bunch of reforms to kind of bring back the proper worship of the God of Israel to Judah. Anyway, that's mentioned in 2 Kings. But the point is, a lot of scholars believe that what the book of the law was that they found was basically Deuteronomy, okay, or some form of it. And so that kind of puts the finding of it in another historical time. Now, the unique thing about Deuteronomy is, there's a lot of unique things. How can I put it? There's the setting and context. One of the unique things about Deuteronomy is that given the context of Josiah finding it, you find in Deuteronomy certain, like for example in the sheet you'll see, in Deuteronomy 12, there's a call for the centralization of worship, which would be in Jerusalem. That's kind of odd because when you read Exodus, it talks about worshiping Yahweh when you get into the land, but there's nothing in Exodus or Leviticus or Numbers about a central place of worship. Later on with King David, there becomes a central place of worship in Jerusalem because Israel and Judah, the people were basically paganizing everything. They would worship anywhere, just like the pagans did, and therefore there was a lot of syncretism. So by the time Josiah came around, he said, no, the proper worship of our God of Israel is here in Jerusalem. And that's why you see it in Deuteronomy 12. It's kind of a Josiah interpreted the law that he found and made that decision to centralize it. That's the idea. Also, that's a unique thing in Deuteronomy is there's the warnings about kingship, which again, if you put it into the context of the Exodus time, there was no understanding that there would be a monarchy initially. That only comes later in the time of Samuel. And so again, what you see in Deuteronomy 17 is some scholars believe kind of like a reinterpretation, not a reinterpretation, but kind of putting into the law that necessity that now that we have kings, the kings better be adherent to the Torah. But that wasn't originally in Exodus because there was no kings at that point. So that's what you kind of see going on in Deuteronomy. Anyway, another unique thing about Deuteronomy is what they call the Deuteronomistic history. What that means, the book of Deuteronomy is kind of a hinge book. It ends the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, but at the same time, the major theological themes emphasized in Deuteronomy are seen in books like Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. That Deuteronomy plus those books are called the Deuteronomic history. Okay, those books were written in their final form probably during the exile, and the reason why that's important is because when the Jews found themselves in exile, their basic question was, how did we end up in exile? We thought we were God's people. These books, what we call the historical books, Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, were all composed in the exile. They weren't written out of whole cloth. They were taken from earlier sources, obviously. But when you read those books, one major theme that happens throughout all those books, it goes to answer the question, why did we end up in exile? And the answer is, look at your past. You guys were always screwing up. Okay? Those books are very clear on the history of Israel, as we'll see. It does not paint a pretty picture. And the point is, taking Deuteronomy as like the founding book for these other books, is they're looking back at the Deuteronomy and they're saying, the reason we're in exile is because we broke the Torah here, 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 and here. And all those themes are in Deuteronomy, and they influence how we read Joshua through 2nd Kings. Okay. Anyway, another interesting thing about the book of Deuteronomy that I want to emphasize, and we've mentioned this before, is the vassal treaty, the suzerain or suzerainty, I can't ever say that word, treaty. We've talked about that with the book of Exodus. The Mosaic Law was seen as a vassal treaty between God as king and Israel as his people. But that's just kind of a general idea. You kind of see aspects of it in Exodus. Deuteronomy itself is set up as a vassal treaty, as you'll see there. There's an introduction of the speaker at the very beginning of Deuteronomy. There's a historical prologue, the history of their time in the wilderness, stipulations, all that stuff, statement concerning the document, the call to witnesses, curses and blessings. The vassal treaty is set up all throughout Deuteronomy. It is a vassal treaty, which is a very important thing. Okay, I give you an outline of Deuteronomy so you can kind of see that. There's a little bit of an elaboration on the Ten Commandments as they're laid out in Deuteronomy. Hopefully that will make sense. I'm not going to force you to memorize that chart or anything, but you kind of see how the book of Deuteronomy is kind of laid out also according to some basic Ten Commandments. And then again, I give you kind of a story chart for how Deuteronomy is laid out, and hopefully that'll make sense as well. Okay, it's kind of long, but I wanted to get through all 3 books, so you'll have the next week or 2 to just kind of work your way through what the textbook tells you about Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, but also hopefully these things will help illuminate things as well. Obviously, once you know the stuff, the best thing to do is to take the time to read through these books, or at least skim through them, and you kind of see how all this works together. All right. Thank you very much. Bye.